political commentators today, Neale Jones, Tim Hurdle. Kia ora korua, welcome.
Kia ora.
G'day.
G'day, Tim. Tim is a former national senior advisor, consultant and director of several companies, National Party senior advisor that is. He is currently the campaign director for Auckland Mayor Wayne Brown. Neale Jones was Chief of Staff to Labour leader Jacinda Ardern, and prior to that, Chief of Staff to Andrew Little, now the Director of Public Affairs firm Capital. Well, what an extraordinary week. Let's recap just some of it. The Health Commissioner's time's almost up, with the board due to return mid-year. Not clear what Lester Levy's role will be then, but some democracy to the board system coming back then. The Reserve Bank Governor is suddenly gone in still unexplained circumstances. New Zealand's High Commissioner to London is gone after what were deemed undiplomatic remarks that highlight the sensitivities of the new order under US President Trump. Let's start with health and a typical Friday afternoon dump, as they say, of the Deloitte's report into Health New Zealand's financial management and this very long-awaited strategic plan. What do you make of it? The Minister making it very clear that more contracting out to the private sector, particularly of elective surgery, of planned surgery, is on the cards.
Yeah, and look, there's always been some sort of overflow to the private sector from the public sector, so that wouldn't be anything new, but he is indicating quite a shift, and I guess the concern would be that if we go from saying where it makes sense or where there's overflow, utilise private capacity, if we start saying, well, actually, we're just going to rely on the private sector as a matter of course rather than investing in the public sector, that I think becomes a real ideological divide that could become quite a debate. I think he was smart to indicate that the board will be put back. I think it was probably an error putting Lester Levy in as commissioner. It became, early on in a government, you want to be able to blame the previous side or blame operational failures on the bureaucracy. By putting Lester Levy in as commissioner, they kind of owned all the problems in the health system. I think by having a board in there, the minister will be able to sort of create a bit of distance between him and the day-to-day operations and be a bit more critical of the organisation with its failures. Not democratic,
of course, I'm going back in history of that, but at least a full board, a full appointed board.
Yeah. And so I think that was probably smart. A couple of good announcements. I have some quibbles with the telehealth stuff. I think it's good as an add-on, good for some services, can't replace a GP. And the nurse practitioners was a good announcement too. I think, Simeon Brown's showing why Christopher Luxon put him in as minister, which is that I think...
How much of this work was done by Shane Retty?
Oh, may well have been. I don't know, but that's the point.
He's done a heap of lot in 3 weeks otherwise, hasn't he?
The trouble Shane had was that he wasn't a great political communicator.
Yeah.
I think Simeon Brown's come a long way from when he was in opposition. He's quite a good political communicator. And so he's doing that thing where you find an issue like health where the government's struggling and you say, here's a flurry of things we're doing to address your concerns. I still think that the fundamental problem that National has in health is that their budget, as much as they trumpet, the largest increase ever, so the largest health budget ever, which of course,
every budget
if you add $1, it's the largest health budget ever.
Yes.
It is not meeting cost pressures. It's falling quite far behind cost pressures, and so every year there is less effective money for each New Zealander, and so every announcement you make, that's got to come from somewhere, and there are only so many comms advisors you can cut. At the end of the day, the vast bulk of the money goes into services, and so that is going to be a real problem for National going forward unless they can turn around that health budget. And I think that is Simeon Brown's major challenge long term.
It certainly looked like a lot of activity, Tim. Was it a lot of activity? And to Neale's point, is what going to count what it delivers?
Yes, it is. And I think Neale's making a case there for more private provision, frankly, because if we want more efficient delivery of the resources we've got, the private sector is increasingly growing. Private hospitals are becoming more common in New Zealand. The government can get those operations effectively and efficiently. That means more services for New Zealanders. I think ultimately people want to see the services in a timely and effective manner. They don't really care a lot about who's paying for it, other than them hoping that's not themselves. I think it's going to be really important that the government does make progress on health. It is a sector that seemed to be in chaos. It has become an issue that's really ramping up in the political polls, and Simeon Brown's trying to take some actions to try and increase the flow of people through the system, and that's what he needed to do.
The argument will be, in the end, it comes back to the level of funding. I know the argument, and we're hearing it already, over more, in fact, most planned surgery going to the private sector is that doesn't necessarily increase the number of surgeons. So many surgeons, a considerable proportion, work in both sectors, and I think there's also some other potential fishhooks in terms of training, etc. But it's been a fairly tepid response so far.
Yeah, look, I just to push back on Tim, I mean, I think when it comes to the use of the private sector, every government says, look, if there's something that the private sector can do that means that we can get through capacity, we should do that. I think there becomes an issue if you have ongoing underfunding of health and, systematic transfer of provision to the private sector. That's probably not what New Zealanders want long term. And so I just think that's something to be very aware of, that when you add that to, say, private funding of health infrastructure, you start to see a more privatised health system. And I think that would be unpopular were that to become a debate.
Okay. Look, the Reserve Bank governor gone suddenly. So much speculation surrounding that. A couple of key pointers seem to be the fact that the budgets, and we're all speculating because Adrian Orr hasn't spoken yet and the invitation remains open, The speculation seems to be focusing in increasingly on the fact that the Reserve Bank's funding window is underway at the moment, how much it gets, and essentially what the scope is, and that the other factor is our business editor pointing out, Adrian Orr very staunch on this idea of keeping sufficient bank reserves. The new government very keen to open up to new players, open banking, etc. Tim. So, until we know, do we just suppose that one or t'other side of that shareholding arrangement had enough of each other?
Yeah, I think the rub between the governor and the political parties actually, particularly Actor National, it predates even the formation of the government. There's always been a tension there. It's been a series of issues, and probably there might have been something that brought it to a head, but clearly there were a number of things that were in play. This is the interesting thing with the bank capital ratios, is it's in that space between regulation and policy, where we're trying to have independent regulators like the Reserve Bank, but there is a policy decision about how you open up the banking market and what level of risk a government's willing to take. So there is going to always be a challenge between both sides as to who has primacy in deciding that. So it's not unusual that something like that would cause a challenge. I think ultimately, though, the both sides get to have a say, and I'm sure Adrian will eventually come out and talk. He's not known for being quiet, so
he's still on leave at the moment, so the bid will remain open till that's done. That's for sure.
Yeah, no, it was quite a remarkable exit not to have any indication from him what happened, and that leads to all kinds of rumours. But I think you're right. The two things pointed at are his expectations of government funding for the Reserve Bank, which has increased quite a lot in recent years.
Staffing's increased and so forth.
Yep, and also the issue around capital reserves for the banks. I actually, have a bit of sympathy for Adrian Orr when it comes to the capital requirements. I don't believe that it's harming the bank's ability to lend. In fact, if you look at bank profits, they are in absolutely rude health. I don't think there's any issue there. In terms of, I think his legacy will be something we'll talk about for a while. I think he's a bit unfairly criticised. He was, probably too loose in the post-COVID period at the start, but if you look around the world, that was the case for most central banks. There's a lot of sort of post-COVID 2020 hindsight that happens, and where I have a criticism of Adrian Orr is more that I think actually more recently he kept interest rates too high for too long, and that drove us into recession and has kept us in recession longer than we should be. And I think that's actually the critique I'd lay on him. Okay,
now the geopolitics is just off the charts at the moment. Everybody, including the leaders of European nations, trying to keep pace with what is going on, particularly since that change in position under the new US administration and that extraordinary meeting in the White House. UK High Commissioner, former Labour government minister, former Auckland Mayor Phil Goff, caught up in the realpolitik of this. He's a diplomat. The comments he made in a Chatham House setting deemed undiplomatic.
Yeah, and look, Phil Goff is a very decent man. I worked with him when I worked in Parliament for Labour. I have a lot of respect for him. I think most New Zealanders would probably agree with what he said, but end of the day, he is a diplomat, and his job is to represent the New Zealand government. And I think given how, let's be honest, there's a madman in the White House who's looking around at allies to smack on the head.
Personal opinion, yes.
And in my personal opinion.
Yeah.
And I think Winston Peters is very sensitive to that, and he had every right to recall him based on those comments.
Tim?
Yeah, well, I've heard the previous High Commissioner, my old boss, Lockwood Smith, talking about his role and his views on this, and I thought I agreed with his comment that ultimately it's not for the New Zealand High Commissioner to the UK to be talking about American presidents and their actions. It was really straying outside his brief. I thought it was unusual a guy with that much experience was asking questions at the very least, let alone asking questions outside his brief at what's effectively a seminar. So yeah, it was kind of a strange way to operate. I guess the really interesting piece will be whether the Americans actually pick up on it, whether it gets pushed back into the system, but hopefully it doesn't become a talking point between the administration and the New Zealand government.
It is indicative of just how exposed and vulnerable New Zealand feels with these incredible shifts happening at the moment.
I think we're in a more dangerous position than we've been in most people's lifetimes as a country. You look at, I remember we were talking last year, I think the three of us, about AUKUS Pillar 2, and I said at the time I thought the US was becoming an unreliable ally because congressional Republicans were blocking aid to Ukraine. I think that the US is now somewhere between an unreliable ally at best and a hostile power to its allies at worst. And, if you look at Greenland and Canada, for example, they're very much a hostile power. So this puts New Zealand in a very dangerous position. We can't rely on the US to defend us. I actually think even if there was a change to, say, a Democrat wins next time, we're only ever 4 years away from it turning its head again. In fact, 2 years, depending on the midterm elections. When you're making alliances and trade agreements, that has to be decades ahead you need to be thinking. Europe, we have some like-minded friends, but, Britain hasn't been able to defend New Zealand since the fall of Singapore in 1942, and they've got less powerful, not more, in the last 80 years. So we really only have one ally in the world we can rely on, which is Australia, and ultimately we have to look a lot more to relying on ourselves. And we're a minnow. We rely on a rules-based international order that is currently being torn up. The Chinese ships in the Tasman Sea were a great example of how vulnerable we are, and I think that means we have to have some tough decisions about our defence spending, around our resilience as a country economically, around how we deal with trade. I think it's time for some serious conversations as a country.
Tim?
Yeah, well, Neale's right, and the AUKUS discussion is interesting, but even the Australians are now under pressure as to whether they'll be able to get what they were trying to achieve, which was the nuclear-powered attack submarines that they would have gained under Pillar 1. There's new officials in the Trump administration and the Defence Department who question the reason that they would give them to Australia. So even Australia, our most important ally, is going to have to reevaluate its defence policies, and because it's particularly tied into the American system. And picking up on what Neale said, the security guarantee that the United States has effectively given the world since 1945 has effectively been withdrawn. And I know for a fact that the Europeans pretty much are now ramping up everything they can get, and have said we've got to get ready, there's a problem here, and I guess we've got to take the signal that we're not immune from that. Well, so it's going to be a very scary time.
It is. And the other issue, of course, there was the white paper started under Labour, which became some kind of strategic review under the new national government. It was due for release. It's past due for release. It's probably being rewritten at pace, because the other unknown is whether this change in the US role sees some other developments in terms of heightening of risks much closer to home than what Ukraine is dealing with. So certainly the speed of this is unbelievable.
Yeah, what was released was the National Security Strategy in 2023 under Andrew Little, and that was pretty much met with multi-party support. What we're missing now is the Defence Capability Plan, which was to pretty much signal our 15-year intentions in terms of our defence procurement. That was due in June last year. That comes with a very, very big price tag. Basically, our Navy needs to be replaced. We need to think about what capabilities we're going to need in the emerging world of warfare, which has got incredibly technologically based, but is incredibly difficult to deal with. And those big price tags are pretty unattractive to a government that's got a structural fiscal deficit. So these are the challenges we all face. The European Union are changing their budget rules to allow nations to spend more money to afford the defence capability that they feel that they need over there. So we might have similar sort of questions here.
Rewriting that May budget again that may have been being drafted since, I don't know, late last year, early this year. Defence spending is, of course, capital spending. The immediate focus is on the government's operational budget, which is virtually all. I think the new spending is already gone basically on health. So whether there is more borrowing and a much deeper dig into capital spending, but the strategy of it and the management of it, so delicate also. It is going to test. It is already testing political leaders and their officials, foreign affairs officials, defence officials and beyond.
Yeah, and I do think, I mean, I know it will be unpopular with this government, but I think we do need to be looking at tax. I think we probably do need to increase revenue. I think already we have infrastructure and public services that are creaking, and to cut deeper into there to pay for more defence will be a hard sell. I do think that given the emerging challenges we face, there actually is a room for a discussion about capital gains taxes and other things like that, because we can't live in this kind of fantasy world of low taxes in the far from benign strategic environment in which we live.
Okay, let's have a look at what Labour got up to last week with respect to a reshuffle and also putting out the very bare bones of a plan. What did you make of that? You go first, Neale.
Look, it was a pretty minor reshuffle. I would have thought they'd be a little bit bolder there, but Chris Hipkins obviously is happy with the team that he's got. I saw, two big rises with Tangi Utakiri and Willow Jean Prime. Tangi is seen by the leadership as having done a good job on the Cook Strait ferries, and Willow Jean Prime, who's been pretty low profile so far, but she's rated by the leadership in her sort of questioning in Parliament around boot camps, and they sort of see this as an opportunity for her to take it in education. She's got an important job as the national leadership looks increasingly, there's increasing questions around Christopher Luxon's leadership. Erica Stanford's name's coming up a lot. Part of that's because she's had a bit of a dream run in education, and I think Willow Jean Prime, one of her jobs is going to be, has to be to pin some of the issues in education, for example, the school lunches on Erica Stanford, and rather than letting her become the white knight who comes and saves everyone from David Seymour's incompetence. The Chris Hipkins laid out in his speech, again, no policy, but he did indicate a series of areas where he's going to be focusing, which is around jobs, health and housing. It was very high level. I think the challenge Labour's going to have this year is going to be how to put meat on those bones and how to sort of show people that they have some new ideas, that they're not going to refight the 2023 election. But, I will say that at this stage in the cycle, if you can hold your party together as an opposition and you can be talking about the things voters care about, that's the first step to getting back. Again, there are some who would want Chris Hipkins to be a bit bolder, but it seems to be working for him. The polls are heading in the right direction.
It's basically do as little as possible, bark at very few dogs, essentially, isn't it? And I'm interested in your take on this, Tim, both from Labour's strategy, but also from the perspective of what may be ahead for the incumbent government. And obviously Chris Luxon has been under some scrutiny, Christopher Luxon. Also, we're about to have the change of Deputy Prime Ministership. What are you hearing, what are you seeing about some of the other challenges, political challenges coming the way of the government?
Well, just briefly on Labour, I mean, they're running the classic small target strategy. The problem they have is that Chippy effectively had his policy bonfire, so if he wants to come out with new ideas, he's going to have to put his hands into a pile of ashes to find some new policies, and that comes with fish hooks. The government is very reliant on an economic recovery that lifts all boats generally, and generally lifts your poll ratings. There are some good signs on the economy. The so-called survive till 25 seems to be a bit true. Some of the economic data is coming their way, and the government will be hoping that is reflected in a recovery in the polls as people regain economic confidence, and therefore equate that with connect that with the government's competence as a manager. So those are the challenges, but the strategy will effectively be driven by economic progress, and that's probably why the mantra of the National Party at the moment is economic growth. And they want to associate that with that.
Yeah, and I tend to think the biggest impact on Labour's fortunes will be whether the economy recovers or not towards the election.
What do you see around this changeover of Deputy Prime Minister role, Tim, and what it might foreshadow one way or another?
Well, it's quite significant, and it's not just in name. I understand that the seats in the House, the allocation of seating in the House changes so that where the New Zealand First MPs are sitting next to the government, they'll swap with the ACT MP. So it will be a physical relocation in the Parliament too. And there was always the question as to whether what Mr. Peters will do after he's Deputy Prime Minister, whether he'll take the opportunity to go to Washington, or presumably London's available too, but I would have thought Washington, and whether there'll be a change of leadership at New Zealand First, and that could be another significant dynamic. But you're also going to get into the phase of the fact we're in the second half of a term, and so these parties will want to assert some degree of brand differentiation outside of the government. So we're already seeing that with ACT, with their treaty principles bill, but they may increasingly want to distance themselves from some of the actions of the government, which also creates instability. But yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see whether there's also accompanied by changes in portfolios. We've had a National Party reshuffle, but we haven't had a change in the minor parties' portfolio allocations.
Been a hell of a start to the year, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, we live in an age of instability and chaos, and that plays out in many different ways.
On that happy note, thank you.
Hey, look, we're seeing the job market finally start to recover, okay?
Yeah, exactly. Some interest rate
A lot of
cuts.
rotation in the job market. New jobs are coming on the new jobs. It's great.
Economy, Tim. Thank you both.
Yeah, on message.
Thank you. Tim Hurdle, Neale Jones.